Alright, ladies and gents, Kid Thunder is back, and welcome to part 2 of my rant talking about the video game industry. If you haven't seen part 1, please stop watching this video and do so now. Part 1's link should be located on the description box on this video of YouTube. But anyways, on with the rant still. Now let me say this. In terms of me still ranting on this video game industry topic right here, for one thing, I want to talk about, say, like the arcade industry. Now, the arcade industry was obviously before the home console market, which would obviously later birth on in as of right now. Come to think of it, as we can see nowadays, the arcade industry is like hardly in any existence today. I don't know what could be the reason why, but it's pretty much a shame that the arcade industry is pretty much dying out, and there's hardly any form of arcade places anywhere in your hometown or whatever. But I'm pretty sure the arcade industry was where the video game industry boom was pretty much at. Now you don't see many arcade places anymore, but come to think of it, I do remember a time when arcade places used to rock the house down. Arcade places was where people go ahead and, you know, chunk up every token and quarter and whatnot into a video game machine and go and edit with all these games. You know, this is the place to be, where people want to just spend some time on these games, and then after that they'll go home for the day. Nowadays people buy arcade cabinets, and in order to play arcade games, nowadays people just, you know, emulate all these games via MAME, or just get a MAME arcade cabinet. But I'm not really sure. Here's the thing. Come to think of it, you know, people are buying all these arcade cabinets to stock them in their own homes. But to come to think about it, like I said in my video response to Viper29's video talking about emulation, in terms of like emulating arcade games, you know, my house is obviously incapable of handling the electricity of an arcade cabinet. But anyways, I'm starting to get off topic. Yeah, in part 1 I was still ranting about the video game industry, like I was taking you back to the days when Nintendo and Sega were being the prime competitors. But here's the thing real quick. It is now 1989, and we are in the 16-bit war with the Sega Genesis, which was released by Sega, as well as the Super NES, which was released in 1991 by Nintendo. Come to think of it, if you look at these two consoles, this is pretty much the milestone of where we call this thing the whole console wars and whatnot. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm trying to be on the fence side with like the angry video game nerd, like stating this, saying, you know, this is pretty much the start of the whole quote-unquote bit wars. Like, come to think of this, nobody in all of the world knows what the hell bits is, and pretty much nobody knows what bits is today right now. All they know is just like, we get a fucking game system and just plug the TV and just play the goddamn game, and that's primarily it. But come to think of it, let's take a look at both of these two systems, the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. Now, come to think of it, both of these consoles have an unbeatable library of games. If you were to name some, Sega Genesis had Sonic the Hedgehog, Streets of Rage, Golden Axe, what else? Contra Hardcore, Castlevania Bloodlines, Mortal Kombat, the first one, which was arcade perfect compared to his Super Nintendo counterpart. And there was a lot of more good games for the Sega Genesis as well too, but I can't really name them off the top of my head because I can't really figure out what are they on the Genesis. Yeah, the Genesis was kind of a good console, but what pretty much killed it off is that the add-ons. The Sega CD, well, I find the Sega CD, in my opinion, an underrated console. Despite the fact that, you know, while the system was being advertised, most of the games that were being advertised on it were basically nothing but shitty FMVs, and nobody was going to buy that. Along with that was the Sega 32X, in which, like, I've heard of it, but it was released as late as like November of 1994, knowing that the Sega Saturn was going to be on its way in about 6 months later. But come to think of it, now the 32X did have some good games, but come to think of it, by the time of the Sega Saturn came out, the 32X was a waste. Another cool thing about the Sega Genesis was that it had this thing called the Sega Channel, in which obviously some people may not know what this thing is. Now, I knew what it was, but I never had a Sega Genesis at the time. I mean, when this was advertised. I mean, some friends of mine back in the day had a Sega Genesis, and he told me that he had a Sega Channel as well too. But yeah, I actually remember the Sega Channel, but even though I never had a Sega Genesis and whatnot, so that's primarily it. Now the Super Nintendo in Japan, they also had a similar service like that too. Over there, I believe it was called the B-Satellaview or some shit like that. I forgot. But the Super Nintendo over in Japan had that similar kind of service too. And if you think the Wii Virtual Console and Xbox Live and the Dreamcast was all that primitive, well, think again. Because, truth be told, the Sega Genesis was kind of like the first game console to ever go online, to have online capabilities. That's what it was. That's what the Sega Channel was. Moving on to Super Nintendo. This system actually had like an unbeatable library of good games, to tell you the truth. And come to think of it, back in 2008, this was when, like, I never actually had a Super Nintendo as a kid growing up, but come to think of it, I actually got one back in 2008, and come to think of it, I still love it. I still love the Super Nintendo, even though as a kid I never owned one. But yeah, Super Nintendo basically had an unbeatable library of games. Yeah, in my opinion, I would say this was pretty much on par with the Sega Genesis, because mainly reason being is that both of these systems had unbeatable library of games on there, and that's what it was all about. So back in the time when, you know, at the end of the 16-bit war, it was in my opinion, I would say it was unclear who was the real winner, because both of them pretty much have a astounding library of good games. Both had like unbeatable titles and whatnot, and both are really good systems. Like, neither one is better than another. So, like, I have both of them, so I really can't complain. And that wraps it up. That's it. Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo. Both game consoles are fun to play. Get them. I can recommend it to you. So right now, folks, this ends part 2 of the video game industry rant. Stay tuned for part 3 as I talk about what makes the industry bad. As of now, Kid Thunder out. Take care.